My name is Kelly, and you guys might have seen some of our other webinars in the past, so thank you for joining us again today. We have a bunch of our old webinars up on our YouTube page right now, and you can see our upcoming ones on coloradofilm.org/webinar-series. We don't currently have a set date and time for a couple next week, but we will have some, so stay tuned for that. This is also going to be recorded and put up on that YouTube page, so you can check it out later or send it to people if they missed it. And what else? If you have questions as we go along, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A box, and you can feel free to send your questions in. They might not appear on screen, but I'll be able to see them. And when we get to the Q&A section at the end, I'll be sure to read them out with our experts here. So now I want to introduce our awesome panel over here. We have Carol Fleisher. Carol, did I say Fleisher right?
Fleisher.
Fleisher. Carol has spent the last 40 years making documentaries for television. She's produced for every major broadcast and cable network, including PBS, National Geographic, Discovery, NBC, and others. Her documentaries have earned Emmy Awards, the Writers Guild of America Award, Humanitas Award, Chicago Film Festival Golden Hugo, and many, many, many others. I could probably go on and on. Carol is currently the Durango regional producer for Rocky Mountain PBS, where she follows her passion for storytelling to preserve and celebrate Colorado's rich history. That's awesome, Carol. And we also have Mitch Dickman.
Thanks, Kelly.
No problem. Mitch is also an award-winning producer and director in both film and theater, with hundreds of productions on his resume over the past decade. His highlight reel includes feature film Hannah Ranch, feature film A Test of Wills, Honduran travel show Off the Radar, short film Mortar, and stage production and Macbeth adaptation Wild West. And I'm missing a lot of them. I know, Mitch, I'm so sorry. As producer and director of the stage production and feature documentary film DNC Mediamocracy, he received the Best Multimedia Ovation Award from the Denver Post and was named Best Example of Theatrical Relevancy in Denver Westward's Best of Awards. Mitch has done everything and worked on dozens of films, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for being here, Carol and Mitch. You guys are awesome, and please take it away from here.
Yeah. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Kelly.
Mitch. I hope everybody's doing well and staying healthy wherever you are. So we thought we'd just give ourselves a little credibility here, in addition to what Kelly just did, and show a little clip. Are you going to show a sizzle reel?
Yeah, I'll show this a little 30-second sizzle. We'll see how the playback goes. One thing I'm also going to work on, and Kelly, please don't take this the wrong way, but I will update resumes moving forward, because that's but it's a good time. So I'm going to share my screen and show a quick sizzle reel that shows some of the past projects as well as some of the projects that I have coming up.
Wow.
There's a recent sizzle we kind of cut together. I also have like a 6-minute version, but I think you guys came on here to hear us talk, and I'll pass it over to Carol, who can show some of her work, so we can put some context.
Thanks. And I just thought I'd show the first 2 minutes of a film I did for PBS a few years ago called Navy SEALs, Their Untold Story. I wanted to call it Unsealed, but the network programmers decided that that wasn't clear enough. And I don't know, cleverness versus clear usually wins. So bear with me for 1 second while I share the screen and switch over.
It was about a 24-hour battle, stretching from one day into the next.
We've been training for years, and this is our 4 minutes.
Every one of them, they gave their life in that rescue attempt. And they did it because one of their own was down.
Widely viewed as the world's combat elite, the clandestine U.S. Navy SEALs have found themselves in the media spotlight, as recent operations have brought these quiet warriors unaccustomed fame.
U.S. Navy SEALs rescued American cargo ship captain Richard Phillips.
They're the superheroes, they're the titans, they're the impossible men doing an impossible job.
Much of their history is as secretive as their missions. But over the decades, the roles of SEALs and their frogmen forefathers have transformed along with evolving threats
An outpouring of
and a 24-hour news cycle. From Hitler to Bin Laden, from countering massive armies to countering terror, from frogmen to high-tech commandos. How have the covert SEALs become the renowned warriors of today? Who are the men behind the face masks, behind the green paint, behind the history?
That's that. So, maybe
And I'll just say too, if those clips live anywhere online, you can send them to me afterwards and I'll be able to blast it out to everybody who's watching so they can watch them more in full.
Great. Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, so that was the 4th highest rated show on PBS in 2014. And was great momentum. And we were the first authorized history of the SEALs working with the Naval Special Warfare. So that it was ambitious, it was big, it had a good budget. I've got a bunch of SEALs who call me mom now, so it's kind of fun.
That's pretty cool. Well, if I could ask a question, like how'd you get the idea? I think that's where a lot of these projects start is, it's like, oh, I'd make a documentary about that. And so it usually takes a lot of years, and I know we'll go through all the stages throughout this, but what was the origin of that project?
On another project, I met 3 Navy SEALs who we just all hit it off famously. And I just asked them if there'd ever been the story of the SEALs properly told. And they all, screamed, no, it hasn't. But then it was sort of figuring out what could be done, what I could get access to, kind of taking my dream of doing the history of the SEALs and then kind of making it practical. PBS was interested in it right away. But the truth is that I had access because of these guys I had met through another filmmaker. And we had a pilot that we did together for Animal Planet. And then there you go. It was the access and knowing these guys and admiring them that made me want to tell their story. And what they told me was that a straightforward history of the SEALs had never been properly done, that there were a lot of factual errors in what had been done, and they'd love to see that. And they got me access to Navy Special Warfare public affairs people. But I also had done a whole bunch of documentaries back in the 80s, yikes, with USAA underwriting them, and for Arnold Shapiro, if anybody's familiar with him, did Scared Straight and Rescue 911, has, I think, 16 Emmys and an Oscar, bastard. Wow. One of my favorite humans on the planet. But anyhow, that was the genesis of it, and then making it something saleable. And then I had to go out and get underwriters for it as well, because PBS couldn't afford the whole ticket.
Great. Well, one of the things that you said, I think is, and for our attendees here, and hopefully we can throw some questions in, but access, I think, is something that was relevant then, is relevant now, and as as everyone is thinking of how they're approaching a documentary film, I couldn't say that like that's probably one of the most important ingredients. If you didn't have access to the SEALs, you probably couldn't have made that film. If we didn't have access to Evel Knievel's family, it wouldn't have been the same film that we had when we made that kind of film. But access today is king or queen in making these films. Would you agree with that?
100%. And it's also, it's the access, and it's also respecting your subject and letting them know that how you're going to approach it. And that's a big part of it. Even though I knew these SEALs, I had to jump through 300 hoops after that. But I wouldn't have even had a shot at this if I didn't know these guys and they vouched for my character. So, and I had other military histories that I'd done that I could show them that were respectful and straightforward, and won a bunch of awards, which is nice. And, that helps too. So it's credibility and access. I'd say passion is a big part of what you're selling when you come up with an idea as well. I feel like when you pitch an idea, just starting at the very beginning of this, that's not even the beginning of the process. The beginning is having that nugget of an idea. Oh gosh, I know SEALs. This sounds commercial. And then, honing that down, figuring out exactly what I wanted to do and could do. So it was a combination of selling my passion for the subject, my access, and a good story well told, which I think is always essential. Because I could have access to the SEALs and tell a crappy story, and PBS won't do it. USAA won't underwrite it. We got Budweiser also. By the way, no free beer, none.
Well, I'll share a little story just on kind of access and also starting, if that's a good thing, because it kind of goes through some of the things that you were chatting on. So at the end of the around actually 2008, 2009, when I stopped doing resumes or bios, I had just come off of the DNC Mediamocracy, which was like a live play. I was, I guess, 26 or something like that, and I really wanted to do narrative filmmaking. And I had read this story in the newspaper about a rancher in Colorado Springs, and I'd saved it, kind of like idea a day you have, and then a month later, like, that was terrible. And about 6 months later, I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I went down and I met the widow of a rancher who had tragically taken his life, and I was like, I want to make a film about you and your family. And I was trying to be as respectful as I could, not come off as like a cheesy Hollywood producer with, unbuttoned vest and those kind of things. And she said, well, you can't make a film about us, but you can do a documentary. And it was kind of like unlocked. And she had Kirk, this is from Hannah Ranch. Kirk had been featured in the book Fast Food Nation, which is Eric Schlosser, who's in Food Inc. and Reefer Madness and a bunch of things like that. And she's like, they turned that book into a fictional film and it was a disaster. Why don't you do a documentary? And so that was 2009, and it took 5 years, as you're talking about, with the passion to make that film and learn the storytelling. I was kind of learning on the job, but the access to the family and just being who I was and being open to not knowing but trying to tell that story with respect. It was like really kind of film school 201 for me to go through that project. But the access to the family, which isn't always easy, and it isn't always like you get that stuff teed up right at the beginning. He had a complicated relationship with his brother, and I had to chase his brother for a year to get him to agree, which is not uncommon for documentary films. That if something's hard to get, you obviously want to respect if someone says no, but it's the art of the chase, kind of like a journalist, and you're kind of chasing down that access because it's not the same story if you can't have all sides or whatever that might be. So that was probably when I first learned how important access was, and that passion, takes years really for a project to come all the way through.
Did you have exclusive access? Were you able to nail that?
At that time, we didn't have a contract that was exclusive, but they weren't talking to anybody else. And, I've had, 40-page contracts that have fallen through, and a lot of the work I still do is, looking people in the eyes, a handshake or I guess an elbow bump maybe will be what we're doing moving forward. But, there's a trust factor and a reputation. And like, as you were saying, credibility, when I go pitch a project now, I'm like, you can talk to a family that was a sensitive situation, or the Denver Post newsroom that I was embedded in, and see if they would work with me again. And that goes, a long ways for kind of moving forward.
So I feel like that's a really good launching point that you guys both just touched on, is that in order to start creating a documentary, you really have to have the passion behind it, because unlike I would say most feature films that maybe take place over a few weeks or a couple months, when you're doing a documentary, like you said, Mitch, this is like years and years and years. So say you have this idea and this access and you're really passionate about it and you really, really believe in it, what are the next questions that you should start asking yourself after that point? Like after you're convinced that this is a good story, where do you go from there?
Sure.
Do you want me to start that?
After you, Carol.
Okay, thanks, Mitch. Thank you. You have to ask yourself some really soul-searching questions about the story. To me, it's always about what level the story is at, what level you can tell a story at, how good the story is, how much it matters. Does it matter? Why am I telling it now? Why me to tell this story? Am I the appropriate person to do it? Has it been done before? Do the research online to see, has this story on the SEALs been done 100 times, and maybe these guys just didn't know about it. But I did find other histories, and this is just one show I'm using as an example. But you really have to convince yourself before you can convince anybody else that this is worth what will be a couple of years of your life. First of all, and it always takes longer to raise the money than make the film, and it's a lot less fun. And it's really important to be soul searching with yourself about your story, and ask yourself what anybody with money you're going to go to asking to pay to tell this story, the questions they would ask of you. Why now? Why you? And what is your access? And how much is this going to cost? All of those sorts of questions can I raise money for this? People, when they find out you're a documentary filmmaker, pitch you in the dental chair. I knew I was ready to give up therapy when my therapist pitched me an idea. And I thought, no. And I'm paying for this? No. But you really have to be honest with your possibilities of fundraising, because there are a million stories I'd like to tell, but there may be 100 that I could raise money for. And so I'm practical. That's got to be part of the equation. But story.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of key words. You're finding your story throughout it. And it's different for everyone, what passion is versus what your specific situation is. Do you want to bounce back and forth between commercial work and a documentary? I'm not crazy about the word passion project, because it implies a certain lack of professionalism. And I think probably a lot of people who are attendees are, they're professionals at this and they want to do things, or you're maybe at a different level in your career. And I've, my passion is for the craft as much as it is for the story. I realized, and again, everyone's different, but no one really cares what I think. I'm not making a film about my opinion on things. I kind of hide behind the camera and want to hear what other people have to think, versus the kind of Michael Moore approach that's here's my political opinion, and and he's well-respected, highly successful filmmaker. But what I found interesting to me is, listening to other people and their passion. And if your characters are passionate, then that kind of comes across on screen, versus being like, I have to tell this story, and then reverse engineering other people on screen to tell that story. As we're kind of citing examples, Rolling Papers is a good scenario with that, where I was making a film with Dan Youngie about Evel Knievel, and he was like, hey, we're, legal is, marijuana is going to be legal in Colorado. They're talking about doing this film again. And I was like, I don't care about weed. Like I have my own personal opinion about it, but it's not something I'm passionate about. And I kind of said no at first. And then I kicked myself. I was like, I could work with Dan Youngie and Britta Erickson. It's happening in Colorado. It's commercial. There's people who would want to fund this. There were 50 filmmakers out on January 1st, but we kind of stayed the course. And so that was another light bulb moment where it was like, it's not necessarily an issue or even a story that I'm passionate about, but I'm passionate about the craft. I'm passionate about the business of it. I'm passionate about the people I work with. So I think you can take that passion component and spread that out across, different sectors for sure.
That's really interesting. Dan's a great guy.
Yeah.
And really good filmmaker.
Yep.
I have found that passion comes with knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Also, early in my career, I did a film called The Singing Cowboys Ride Again. And, oh God, it's like, yikes, singing cowboys. Oh my God. You could, and I was in my early 20s and could not have been less relevant to my life. But as I got into it, I really got into it. And I found this with almost every film, unless there's some unlikable humans involved, that the more I research, the more story I love the subject suddenly because I know about it, and I now have a story to tell because I know more about it. But I took to playing Gene Autry on my cassette deck in my TR6 Triumph driving onto the lot in LA. But I'm pretty sure I was the only 23-year-old woman in LA blasting old cowboys singing. But I really believe knowledge becomes passion too.
Yeah, I agree.
So speaking of getting started, and Carol, you had mentioned a couple minutes ago that you had to get good at fundraising, and I'm wondering if that's something that you had to learn on the fly, and maybe if you guys could speak to how to start financing your project, who do you go to? All of it. All of it. Yeah.
You want to start, Mitch?
Rob a bank. No, I'll let you go, Carol, first. And chime in.
Well, I just have a trust fund with unlimited amount of money. No, I wish. Wouldn't that be nice? So now I work for a network, and it's a whole different matter. But for the 42 years before that, I had to grovel for money every project. When I wasn't working for another production company. And that's something too that I think is important to keep in mind. If you don't have a ton of experience and access, you can team with a more experienced production company who will cover all the stuff you don't want to even really think about, like insurance and legal and all of that stuff. And they have credibility maybe with the network you want to be at. So that's something to think about as well as pitching it yourself. But yeah, groveling for money became an art form that I'm not sure I was ever really comfortable with it. My voice, look at that, my voice went up. But I realized it's a necessary thing. You just have to humble yourself to be at the point where you realize you have to ask somebody else to pay for your film. So who's that going to be? So you think about obvious suspects. And when my production company was at its height, I was making films for PBS, National Geographic. We did Nova, we did Animal Planet, all of the cable suspects, I would call them. And you just kind of knew, oh, this is a Discovery thing. Oh, this one has animals. It's got to be Animal Planet or Nat Geo. It's not so cut and dry anymore, of course, with the millions of streaming platforms and other choices and self-producing stuff too, which I've done it. I don't recommend it. It's really dangerous. It's so expensive, and you just, I had to make a rule that I would never self-fund again after I did that in 1993. Friend's search for her father, who was a missing pilot in Vietnam. that was a passion project. And I have to admit, I probably crossed a million lines in making it. But I ended up having half the money coming from Channel 4 in the UK and the rest from Discovery Channel. And then I had a distributor involved also. So there are, and in those days, sometimes the distributor would pay up to 50% of the budget. And then they walk in with you to Discovery or PBS, where you pretty much had to have, still have to have full funding somehow. So it's matching up, it's knowing who your audience is, where it would play, what you're in sync with, different networks go through different phases. And there were times when I was the it girl, and with Discovery, because we had a big hit with Why Dogs Smile and Chimpanzees Cry. By the way, my favorite of all my children. And I forgot to reproduce, so I do consider my films my children. But it kind of goes in cycles, and you just have to figure out, like the Learning Channel. When it started, it was really the Learning Channel. They weren't tossing midgets and doing underwear histories and all the stuff that's on there now. It was really the Learning Channel, and then it morphed, and that's happened so much. So it's doing your research, knowing who you think this would appeal to, knowing who has a male audience of 25 to 56-year-olds, whatever the niche might be, that your film would speak to. But you also want to try and find as broad an audience as you can and as much money. So it's also talking to other filmmakers. I think I've, sharing intel with friends, and who's paying what, and, what kind of a back end deal can you get, meaning, a percentage of whatever they're taking in from overseas distribution, exploitation, downloads, all of that stuff. So it's more research.
Yeah, it's definitely a learning process, and I'm still figuring out the fundraising battle. So I get that question a lot, and I know there's a lot of experienced filmmakers on here. We all struggle with that. Like, where do you get the money? How do you get it? I think it is important what Carol was saying, though, kind of looking at the back end of distribution as being like, if we can get money from a distributor as soon as possible, that's the best route. And the good thing about a documentary versus maybe a narrative film or other things is you might not have to spend a lot of money at your first stage. So I think kind of breaking it in chunks, not feeling like, all right, I'm gonna go out and hit up a dentist for $1 million to make my project, and then sell it for $10,000 to Channel 4 or whatever it might be. But you've got to kind of look at it all the way through the cycle and think of distribution. And I wish I would have taken more business classes, because it's just kind of basic economics of how much does it cost to make? What can you sell it for? And then you can kind of go out and pitch from that standpoint. So that's the first thing I would say. Otherwise, the options for fundraising are there's so many. Can you do a crowdfunding campaign? I keep saying I'll never do another one, and I've done 3 now. Can you get incentive money from the state? They apply to documentaries. I've been a part of a number of projects. How do you do that? How do you go and pitch the EDC? How do you tell a Colorado story where, for a $200,000 film, if it's all local spend, you can get $40,000 from the state. That's a significant chunk of change. So you start to kind of cobble things together. It's not likely that you're going to bump into some stranger at a bar and they're going to have $1 million for you. Donations, if you can keep.
That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep going to bars, by the way.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Once you self-distance.
Yeah. Equity is tricky on documentaries, I think. If you're promising a return, what are the terms and can you really do that? And there's some, creative ways around getting as much soft money, hard money versus soft money as a term. The more donations, the more incentive money, grants, things like that you don't have to recoup. Maybe that puts you in a situation where you can do that. You said knowledge is passion. I think, this also helps in the standpoint. I try to read not the trades necessarily, but as much of the business articles and hear what, experts on the coast are saying. I was fortunate a couple years ago to Sheffield Dock Fest, which is an incredible festival that's also a project market that you can take your project to. And the European model of financing is very different, but still applicable to, United States filmmakers, where you can cobble together different territories. So, we could spend the whole session, and we would just be two opinions on how to finance. But I would say, do it from as many different, diversify the amount of places you can get it from, spend as little as you possibly can, and try to sell it to the places where you can get the most return. And I think you can take it to a sizzle or to a trailer, and you don't need to complete the entire film, but then you're going to need, really strong written materials or attached people. There are names within, the documentary film business. If you attach a Dan Youngie to a project, or an Alex Gibney or a Kitty Green or people like that, that can also help in the same way that, having a movie actor would help your project as well.
Yeah, and you're right. We could spend the whole time talking about different ways. I do think you just have to be clever too, and entrepreneurial about it if you're going to be an independent filmmaker. Going to, I used to go, and I still do, go to the Jackson Hole. Let's see, it used to be Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival. Now it's Jackson Hole Wild, I think, or Jackson Wild. Anyway. For natural history filmmakers, that is the pinnacle. There's just nothing, there's Wild Screen in Bristol, England, but it's Jackson really is a place where people get together and they get to know each other in this fabulous setting. And I came up with a marketing gambit by accident. I brought a really good bottle of tequila to share with some friends who were my distributors. And suddenly I've got a crowd of 30 people with the head of every network around me wanting a taste of this tequila I brought. So there was one bottle in 1995, and then it was, 3 bottles in 97. And I think it was 14 bottles the last time I went. So, but it was my,
can I come?
Pardon me? Yes, of course. You're invited instantly, immediately. It's going to be a lot cheaper if we do it by Zoom. But anyway, it was just, I made friends. And then you can ask a friend a question. What can you get for this kind of a film? Or could you introduce me to so-and-so at the network, because I don't know them? And it's making those human connections, the 6 degrees of separation, fewer and fewer, and being somebody that the people, and if you're going to a network, that they trust with a budget and enjoy working with. Those are 2 big things from their point of view, and know that you'll deliver. But I do think that human contact, if you can get to these festivals, there are a million of them. And if you can get there efficiently, it's a great networking tool.
Well, and sorry, just to jump on that, the situation, thank you to the film office for putting these kind of things together. The virtual thing, I think, is going to open up accessibility. It'll make the market crowded for sure, but like Sheffield is virtual, Series Fest is going to be virtual, South by, what used to take, thousands of dollars and to get to somewhere, a couple $100 or whatever, can now be done differently. So I think taking advantage of this time from a knowledge standpoint, see how things are changing, because the market's a little tricky right now as far as what all the streamers are doing and acquiring content. So yeah, just tracking all that stuff and then getting tequila and hopefully.
Wait, don't steal my marketing technique.
I won't. I'll do it.
I know, this is live. You heard it here first, everybody.
Oh,
Carol recommends
what did I
tequila everywhere you go. That's awesome.
One other thing, I would subscribe to Real Screen magazine too. It's really it's free, I think, and it's an insider's view of what's happening all over nonfiction production. It's just a really useful tool.
Thank you. I just kind of wanted to do, in my head, I'm going through just the steps of making this documentary, right? So I wanted to hit on a couple of those. best practices for budgeting and shooting and distributing. Before we get to Q&A, I want to remind everybody who's watching that you can submit questions. We've got a couple on the side that I'm just keeping over there for the moment until we get to them a little bit closer to the end. But there's never enough money, right, in filmmaking in general, and probably especially in documentary filmmaking. So I'm just wondering if there are places that you would advise for people just to, like, you can't cut here. You can't have less than like something that's really good, whether that's equipment or travel or what have you. But if you have any budget advice, I think that could be helpful for folks who are watching too. I
wouldn't chintz on people. That's the last place I would chintz. It would be on a DP, on an editor. I write my own stuff, so I never chintz on myself. But, well, I always chintz on myself. I'm the last person to get paid.
But I think that's an important thing. People are like, oh, I don't need to pay myself. I'm going to pay everyone else. And I echo what you said, Carol, which is take care of yourself, you know? And that's not being selfish by any means, but that shows up in the quality of the work.
It does, because you can't help but be a little bitter if you've spent a year doing something and you haven't gotten anything for it. So you do have to budget for yourself in whatever number of hats you wear. And in documentary, it's frequent that it's a producer, writer, director, coffee maker, hyphenate. So make sure you get paid for craft services, that sort of thing. Yeah. And try not to go out of pocket would be big advice. But you end up doing your ideal budget first, always. And I have a link to the IDA, the International Documentary Association. Kelly, I can share that with you after, and maybe you could post that.
Yeah, I'll send that out.
That has budgets. It's got a great budget template you can download. It's just Excel. You don't need a Mitch and I were talking about this. I used to use just Movie Magic, and I think that's what you said you use.
Yep, that's what I use.
Great, robust budget program, and it melds with a scheduling program. It's genius how it ripples the numbers when you change one thing globally. But I'm pretty sure that this link I'm offering up has the same ability to ripple globals and that sort of thing. But so you do your ideal budget first, and then you laugh at yourself, and then you get real. And okay, I can't have 25 weeks of rough cut editing, but I can have 5. And also there's certain numbers that the networks, if you're producing for one of the traditional networks, there's certain barriers that they won't let you go past. Percentages of the budget for overhead, that sort of thing, are limited. I think it's generally 5%. Can't be more than 5% for the overhead. And I think 10% is the maximum for production company fee, but that's another way that you can cover your own stuff as a production company fee. Contingencies seem to be a thing of the past, and that's a shame, because it's really useful to have a little pot of money for the unexpected. Do you still get contingencies, Mitch?
I do. I mean, I put them in there. But I think you've hit on a lot of the things. Production fee is something I've been doing over the last couple of years that I think is important, that I kind of cheated myself out of at the beginning. And I fight pretty strongly for that now. Contingency, I think, is key. Documentary specifically, I think, it's a joke to fix it in post, but really, like, an editor is so important, and maybe one of your most important people or team members, and however that person wants to, we'll get into production and post a little bit later, but however that person kind of wants to work to really support them and set them up for success will make your project, which then the dance with scheduling, it's a dance between budgeting and scheduling, like how long it will take, as you were saying. And then I try to put more money above the line than probably most people do: producers, directors, writers, creatives. Below the line, I'm probably just, in my own, theory, a little cheaper on that side. That's no offense to anybody, but I mean, I think documentaries can be done with smaller crews. You don't need as much equipment. everyone would love the latest Red or Airy Mini or whatever, but like if your story is strong, and you have a DP that knows how to, get the best footage possible, I think you can do okay with that. But I think it is breaking up above the line, below the line, your post, and then kind of your other, to allow yourself to get the project across. Kelly, you still there?
Oh.
Okay. Sorry, froze for a second.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, you're good.
No, but I mean, I think it's a dance with scheduling. It's hard, and you got to prepare for some of those things, but you don't want to schedule. It's hard to budget a 5-year documentary,
Yeah.
so you've got to kind of also allow for some of those gaps in time, but you're not putting people on hold necessarily. And I agree, movie magic is great, but you can do it in a Google spreadsheet. It still comes down to that kind of like, if you keep it simple, especially as you're starting off, you can get, overly complicated with how you want to approach the budget, and fringes, and all those kind of things. The other thing I would say is a line producer or production coordinator, or another producer to kind of keep you in check and call you out if you're getting it twisted on certain line items or things like that, can be a good checks and balances.
If it's your production company, I promise you will keep an eye on the bottom line. Yeah. And because sometimes you feel like people are reaching directly into your personal pocket. And I know it's not meant that way, but it feels that way sometimes. When it's your production company and you've guaranteed a budget and costs are going up, and you get a little freaked out sometimes about that, but which is why contingency is so nice. But I find that some networks just won't do it anymore. But so with the budgeting, there's a top sheet, and forgive me if I'm going too basic here, but there's a top sheet, and then there are subcategories that flow from that. So the top sheet is something that you'd want to be able to give even early on in pitching process, because everybody wants to know what it's going to cost. Whoever you're pitching to get money from, they're going to want to know what the total cost of the project is, at least within, 10% maybe. Mm-hmm. And you can tell them this is a work in progress, and I just penciled this out, even though you've spent, 6 months doing it maybe. But, I just threw this together for the meeting, and minimize it going in. But it's really good for you to know what your ballpark is, and if you're batting in or out of your ballpark. And it's something that you should get straight pretty early. I often have prepared like 3 different budgets. So one to take to a deeper pocket underwriter, one to take to, okay, I'm gonna pitch this to the military channel when that existed. And I know they only have $150,000 an hour, but over here, these guys I know can pay $500 an hour. So I'm gonna pitch them with a budget like that. And I think you're also respected if you know more about the buyer. Then when you go in, they don't want to have to tell you who they are. You should know that from your own research, and that's true. If you want to go in and say, listen, I can produce this on the cheap for 150, or I can do it for 500 an hour, what range is comfortable for your network, you can do that. And just know that you can do it if you're going to offer to do it at that bargain price, that you really can do it, and that you can eat while you're doing it.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Had to unmute. Just moving into production, I know that there are 4-year university programs about documentary production and filmmaking, so forgive me for trying to squeeze this into like a 10-minute thing. But I guess one burning question I have is, like, how do you make sure that you make it to those moments that you need to make it to when it comes to documentary filmmaking? Because from an outsider, it looks like they could be really, I don't know, not random, but unscheduled. So I'm wondering how you could possibly capture those moments, and also maybe if you can just talk a little bit about like the same question in terms of the budget, like where you can't cut when it comes to the story that you're telling, in terms of the actual like shots that you're trying to get.
Yeah.
That was like 2 questions at once, so take whatever you want.
Do you want to start?
I think that it's kind of the Wild West. You can do whatever you want. That's what's fun about documentaries is it's a little fluid, and there's a lot of different work that's being done out there in the way production is handled. I think one of the key things to kind of decide at the beginning is, you know, interview based or observational based, or a combination of the two, and how you're going to approach those, how you're going to schedule those. And you can get into the weeds on all those things. If it's interview, is it lit? Is it natural light? Is it eyeline? Is it going to be telling a story through talking heads, which kind of comes in and out of like people being into those things. If it's observational, like what kind of access do you have? You know, where are you embedded? How are you covering it? You know, is it 2 cameras? Those are kind of the ways that I approach production and really adapting it, you know, to the story. So I think there's a lot of ways you can go from there.
A lot of it is dictated by what budget you can get too. For an observational thing, you know, you've got to be able to have multiple cameras in place, and cameras are cheaper now than they used to be. So that's good. And also people are used to seeing like a GoPro image, or now they're used to seeing this. So anything above Zoom level is going to be, you know, gravy. But I like to think about also do I want a narrator or not? Going in. And my style usually is to have the subjects tell as much of the story as possible, the whole story if possible. Although it's really fun to write for a narrator, I enjoy that. I think it's a more intimate experience for the viewer not to have that voice come in and interrupt the people whose story you're actually telling. Unless it's a familiar, warm voice. For those of you who might remember Charles Kuralt, did a series with him, and, you know, just, oh God, that voice and the poetry that came out of him. It was, you know, that's a narrator that I could listen to him read the phone book. But oftentimes, you know, you're not going to be able to afford a big time narrator, and it's going to be an intrusion, but you got to figure out in advance if you need to get your characters to tell everything, because it's a different style of shooting. If you are, you know, if you have the luxury of knowing, oh, I can have a narrator tell that part of the history, I'm not going to worry about getting it in my interview. But personally, I like to get everything I possibly can in the interview. And now it's not even paying for tape, let alone film. So it's, you know, just ones and zeros in a box. So I indulge in doing way too long interviews. It costs more in transcripts. It costs more if you have an assistant editor logging. It costs more for the editor going through it all. But I find that you get a better film if you've really interrogated the hell out of your subjects and know that you have them telling their own stories.
Yeah, I'll just kind of go through a couple of specifics. Hannah Ranch was pretty much all interview based, and then B-roll. Like, it was right when DSLRs were coming out. We shot everything in natural light, a 2-person crew, DP and me, you know, specific eyeline every time. Rolling Papers was my first foray into observational. Like, we really were just sitting in the newsroom of the Denver Post with nothing happening, or with a pot critic reviewing weed, or like whatever it is, and you kind of schedule those moments. Being Evil was a 4-camera green screen shoot with interviews all spread out around the country that had to be scheduled, and we were shooting C300 Mark II and then Blackmagic cameras for the other angles. And probably one of my favorite projects, which just came out a month or 2 ago, Silent Rose, was just me, myself, an FS7 and a set of cinema primes at a high school. And I wanted that kind of gritty handheld look and that kind of connection through the lens versus off to the side. And then you just kind of keep adapting it to what your story is, what your budget is, all those kind of things.
And as far as getting that key moment, if you're talking about an observational style thing or just a moment of human connection, you it depends completely on the subject. Like if you're a fly on the wall, just observing, it's one thing. It's another thing if you can get somewhere in between and you can kind of know that, oh gosh, this Navy SEAL hasn't seen his old CO in 20 years and they're going to have a reunion. I know I want to film that moment because there's the potential for emotion that you wouldn't get otherwise from, quiet warriors. And in something like, Why Dogs Smile and Chimpanzees Cry, it was more revelation about animals having emotions. This is over 20 years ago, so it was scientific heresy, but it was, sometimes in the field, it was a moment of animals meeting or of a reunion between an animal and a human, that sort of thing. And that you can time to at least be there and have enough cameras, be there in the right moment and get it. Some of the rest of it is just being such a keen and careful observer and seeing, oh God, that guy looks like he's getting pissed off. I want to see what's going to happen here, and just turning your frame a little bit. It's just being a human observer and being intuitive about where you should be pointing yourself and your camera.
It's great.
Thank you. So our first question has something to do with distribution. So I'm thinking maybe we start to transition into these questions and, throw in any distribution thoughts that you might have. The first question is for Carol. How were you able to interest PBS in your film? I think you touched on that a bit in the beginning, but for those of the audience members who might have joined a little bit late, could you talk about what that was like?
Well, first of all, I knew the people who ran programming at PBS at the time, so that makes it a lot easier. I had plied them all with tequila. So not only did they owe me a drink, they didn't exactly owe me a commission, but they were certainly willing to listen to me. That said, it was 2013, I think, that I brought it to them. And, so much had just happened at that time with bin Laden and with the rescue of Captain Phillips and all of that, that I just went in and I said, I've got the first, how did we put it? It was the first authorized telling of the history of the SEALs with the cooperation of the US Navy. Do you want to make, I of course wanted 10 hours and ended up with 2. And it goes that way a lot too, where you think that this story can't possibly be told in less than 18 hours. Ken Burns, do it. And but very often, if it's a one-off, they're not going to put the promotion into a special or the money, invest it in something that isn't an evergreen possibility. So anyway, I immediately had them with access with my buddy. My co-producer was a former Navy SEAL turned stuntman, so he knew all the Hollywood stuff too, and he was just a really affable guy who, it gave us credibility that I had a co-producer who was also a Navy SEAL. So they knew that we were really in the community. But so it was access, timing, they trusted me, and it was a good package.
Think of equipment from that standpoint. Buy things used. I've done a fair amount of used equipment to be able to get through. But if it's a solo, I would say a good camera with a good lens if you can, good audio equipment. That's usually what suffers the most. Is everyone worries too much about camera and then the audio doesn't sound good. So investing in a good shotgun mic or a lavalier system would be my advice.
Sometimes you make subcontractors, audio people, really happy if you rent their gear. Yeah. And it's the way they make enough to round up their living. And I never really wanted to own much gear. when I started my company, it was in LA. And so we had access to the best equipment all the time, whatever we could afford, as Mitch pointed out. But I know that it makes a huge difference to a sound guy or gal if they're getting an extra 150, 200 bucks a day for their gear rental, versus you owning it and here, use my gear. That would, I don't mean to disagree with you, Mitch. Never, God forbid.
I think that's a good point. And yeah, if you can hire a DP that, you know, has their own equipment, you know, I think there's a threshold, like when you get into some of the bigger camera packages or audio gear, depending on the situation, you know, you can rent from a rental house or from, you know, that person that's an owner operator. But if you're kind of starting solo, I think just keep it reasonable. It's only kind of filmmakers are like, what camera did you shoot on? The audience doesn't care. The distributors don't really care. You know, to a certain point, 4K delivery is becoming a little bit more standard, but, and I can't keep up with the Z1, X9, 4K, 6K, all that kind of stuff right now. I think everything's gotten pretty good.
I did a co-production with a Japanese company. We shot a reunion on Iwo Jima of survivors from the Japanese side and from the American side. And it was pretty touching, but the Japanese production company had started the project in 8K. And so storage became a real issue and a pain in the ass, frankly. So we had to dumb down for the American version. But yeah, no, you got to think about the workflow too.
Yeah.
In post, if you're using Red, it's proprietary workflow, and you know you have to make sure that you understand what the implications of that are for post and how many different steps you might have to go through depending on where, you know, is it going to be on your edit system? Is it going to be somewhere else? You know, does it have the memory? Does it have the bandwidth to handle whatever it is you're wanting to do with it, with all that really rich, lovely footage from your Red shoot? Is it practical?
Yeah.
Really sorry about that, you guys. My internet failed for the
Welcome
first
back.
time in one of these webinars. Unfortunately now, though, because my Zoom reset, I can't see any of the questions. So Mitch, if you wouldn't mind continuing to moderate the way that you're doing and reading those questions, if you can still see them.
For sure. No. So the next question was, how much prep versus how much is spontaneous while filming? Prep questions for story, for people interviewed. Can you address the prep process prior to filming and helping people open up and feel comfortable? So that's a great question.
Great question. Yeah. Good. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite parts of the process is that trust factor with the subject and acting as if there's a camera. My aesthetic is that making them forget that the camera's there and that you know, you're establishing a trust and just that you're a person that's listening to them and you're not going to violate that trust and you're going to respect them. I think it's tricky. I don't have any golden rule on, you know, talking to people before they do the interview. I keep it pretty light, like try to not to get people to overthink things. I make jokes. I make stupid questions. You know, what's your favorite color? You better say that again, just to get people kind of to lighten up on set. From that standpoint, there's other schools of thought that, you know, you should show up the first time with a camera and that that's the way you should do it. That's a valid process. The one thing I would get concerned about is if you're establishing a huge relationship with the main character and you're getting all this stuff off camera over the phone or like, you know, at the coffee shop or at the bar, and then afterwards they can't get you to say it on camera. So you kind of have to thread that needle of how much you're getting on camera, how much you're getting off camera. Because if it's off camera, it doesn't exist. Doesn't matter if they confess to something. Everyone, maybe you guys have seen Jinx, you know, but like he was still wearing a wire when he said, I did it at the end, or other things like that. I think you want to allow for some space with spontaneity. My favorite question probably is, you know, what haven't I asked you? You know, what am I missing? Those kind of things versus I'm not a big fan of leading questions. Like if you have a point to prove and you're just trying to get your subject to say what you want them to say, it'll come off kind of canned and forced. And I think the camera can tell if you're being honest or not.
This is one of those things about scripting beforehand or afterwards too.
Yeah.
And I hate scripting beforehand. I like having an outline so I know what I have to cover. And but I don't know, I find it limiting when you script in advance that you're trying to force, even if, you know, if it's a history piece, you know you have to hit this event, this event, this event. But you don't want it to come across as you having, I mean, just hire a narrator if you're going to do that.
Yep.
It's just not authentic. I agree completely with Mitch. If you can afford to scout, if you can meet the people in advance without a camera, without anything there, maybe a notepad, but basically just there human to human and letting them know who you are. I found that listening at a scout is one of the most important things I can do. Of course, it's important in an interview too, but at the time that you have a crew in somebody's home and you're ready to shoot an interview, you want to keep the conversation pretty much on anything but the subject at hand. At least this is what works for me. Excuse me. And I just want them to know I'm a decent, fun human being who cares about them, and that just makes a huge difference. But if you don't give them questions in advance, I think that really makes it sound stilted, because they rehearse, subject rehearses in their head and it comes out sounding stilted. Spontaneity is always a good thing in documentary, in my opinion. And it's, you know, even if I've scouted somewhere, I think it's really important. I know I want to put my subject right here with that background, but maybe I forgot to turn around and, oh my God, they're the Tetons right there or something, you know, that you didn't see. Being open to that kind of spontaneity, I think, is key.
I have one question before. I think I can send you questions in the chat, Kelly.
Yeah, I just saw that.
Maybe the most important question, Carol, what type of tequila?
I saw that came from Marielle.
Yeah.
I'm not giving away my secrets on a webinar. Are you kidding? This is bad enough that I gave you this clue. You know, do your own research with me
Really
present.
Mitch, I just saw that you sent that one question, the Ken Burns effect. Have we talked about that yet?
No, I'm going to send it to you so you can do them.
Okay, perfect. So asking, when showing still images, is it still trendy to use extensive panning and zooming like the Ken Burns effect?
Can't say it's trendy anymore, since the effect is called the Ken Burns effect, but at least in Final Cut. You know, stills without motion on them are, you know, it's a slideshow. You just don't want to do it. And in supervising a history series at Rocky Mountain PBS, we have and one with no budget, we use a lot of archival material and a lot of stills. And the thing I can't stand is when it turns into a slideshow, or for those of you old enough to remember film strips, that was, you know, an image, an image, an image. And it's not, you know, I think you want to have the eye going on a journey as well as everything else. To me, the whole story needs to be on a journey with movement and pacing, and part of it is moves on stills. And some people do snap zooms and things like that, and it works for a little bit. And also there are tons of effects now, of course, that you can do in Premiere. Jitteries and slapping them in and out. And I mean, there's a million variations on the Ken Burns slow zooms, but personally, I like to keep it straightforward and just have the camera go where I want the audience's eye to go.
Yeah, I would agree. And this may, like, just even using the word trendy, if something's trendy, it's probably already out of trend a little bit. It's acceptable, and sometimes it's necessary, and that might be the only thing you can do. I'm not a fan of filmmakers that draw too much attention to themselves. Like, it should be about the story, and it should be about, like, why do you need to push in, or why do you need to do this, or whatever. Like if the image can do it by itself, I think that kind of does most of the work. Oftentimes I think, if you're getting into a branded content spot or an action movie or something like that, cool shots, cool tricks make sense. But in a documentary, you should be pushing the bar for sure, and trying things and pushing boundaries and all of that, but not if it gets in the way of the story. And I learned this lesson, the hard way on a film I did a rough cut screening of, where I tried to, really kind of experimental ending with 3 different ends, and it had really undermined my main subject story. And everyone at the end was asking me about the filmmaking and this and that, and it was a very personal story. And I was like, oh, that's right. I just kind of have to keep remembering that. I don't want to say it's not about you, but you're using that as a vehicle to let the story and the characters kind of shine. So if it can be simple and powerful, and the image is important, you can just put it up there however you want. I think that's a fine way to approach it.
Containing ego is an issue, and it's like you can write a flowery script that just nobody can follow with an ear instead of reading it. And you can show how smart you are, but it's not telling the story. Yep. It's the same thing with filmmaking technique. You don't want technique over substance. Style over substance, to me, is a failure of storytelling. Yep. And it's just showing off that, look, I can do this trick with the gear I have, versus respecting your audience and engaging them in the storytelling, bringing them along on your journey in the way you want the information revealed, I think is more important than any stylistic thing you can do.
Thank you. I'm looking at the next question, which is, can you share the URL and names of the budgeting tools? The answer is yes. I can get with Carol and Mitch and send out a follow-up email with those.
I can actually paste that in right now.
Yeah,
for
please.
The budgeting thing.
That would be awesome. No promises on a follow-up webinar on best practices and guidelines. We'll see if that's possible. It could be a good idea. That was part of the question as well.
Typing the answer. Can everybody see these, or is this just to?
If you do it in the chat on the side and make sure that it's.
It's in the Q&A. Do you want it in the chat?
You can type it into the answer, yeah, and everybody should be able to see it too.
I pasted it in. Did that work?
Looking, all panelists and attendees.
Where'd it go?
It went away.
How did it go away? Because I answered it?
Possible.
Yeah. I think I might be able to help. Let's see.
Thanks, partner.
Awesome. Thank you, Mitch. There we go. Yeah, he just sent it out to everybody.
Good call.
Perfect. Looking along, so this is about crews and kind of the roles that everybody plays on documentaries. Small crews, multi-hyphenates, what do your crews tend to look like? Are you having people fill multiple roles at once? Are you keeping it to just a couple people? We can talk about that a little bit.
Unless you're doing big reenactments or something where you really need, gaffer and truck and lights. More lights than for interview. Unless you're doing something major like that, then I like to keep it as intimate as possible. I think it's like, I don't know, you're asking people to tell a piece of themselves, even if it's a recipe, it's a piece of themselves that they're entrusting you with. And, I take that really seriously. I don't mean to sound, holier than thou, but it's true. It's a real privilege to have people tell you their stories. And so I like to keep it intimate. I like to keep it with people who I know will treat the talent appropriately. They have a sense of humor, but they're not gonna be jerks in somebody's home. I've had it happen. And I had a sound man make anti-Semitic remarks, and I'm Jewish, and I was paying the guy, but also he doesn't know who the people we're filming, what their background is, and all of that. So there are jerks that you end up wanting to avoid for the rest of your career. But anyway, I like to keep it very small. It's usually 4 people. camera, sound, and a production manager / everything. And then I fill in wherever there's a hole, and I'm capable of filling in. You know, usually it's carrying the sticks, but you know, I think it's more intimate. And it's also, you're less likely to break things in somebody's house. It's just a lot of reasons to keep it small.
I think a 4-person crew is a great baseline that kind of covers your major areas, and you can scale up or down there accordingly. Like I said, I've done a project with just myself. I really like to shoot with certain DPs. Sometimes we can handle sound ourselves, you know. Sound becomes kind of the third one for me. I produce as well, so I can kind of try to do most of my producing work ahead of time, but having a production manager, coordinator, or line producer there would be great. And then it can scale, you know, crazy up from there depending on how many setups you have. And I'll just share a fun story with Kitty Green's casting Jean Benet that we shot here. Their interviews, they had a full art department team. The way that she brought art to, I mean, a full team as in like 3 people, but like her and her DP's like level of attention to detail on the artistic component of the frame was something I hadn't seen before, something that was exciting to me. And then we did recreations as well, where we built, you know, they built a full set, and we had full G&E team and had a 20-person crew on a documentary, but there were, as you said, kind of recreations. And, you know, as Carol said, like making your subject feel comfortable in whatever environment you're in. You know, you just kind of tell your crew according to that. You don't want, I was filming an audition with my wife earlier today, and my daughter was in the background. She tried to kind of like sneak out, and it was just distracting. And I was like, you know, you kind of want that same thing on your set. Like if people are engaged and paying attention, then that's fine. But if you've got someone that's constantly texting on their phone or like not really contributing to it, it can, you know, be more detrimental than helpful.
Thanks. And I was going to save this question for the end. I know we have 2 more that I do want to get to, but Carol's comments and then what you just said, Mitch, made me think of it, is that you were at one of our educational road shows, Mitch, and you said something that really stuck with me, which was you've just got to be a good person at the end of the day when you're doing especially these observational pieces. And I wonder if you could just say a couple words about that and about how, you know, it's about more than filmmaking at the end of the day.
So, sorry, say that one more time.
No problem. I was just saying that you mentioned at an educational roadshow once that it's really important to be a good person when it comes to observational documentary making. And I just wonder if you could say a couple words about how it's more important than filmmaking at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think you're going to be in a lot of different ethical situations where, you know, at the end of the day, hopefully you are a good person with your crew, with your subjects and all that. Like, I did a project with teens with drug use, and we had to run through this narrative. Like, you know, what if someone ODs, or what if someone's going to hurt someone, or what, you know, when do you interject? When do you cross? And that's just an individual moral compass thing. And I think, you know, to things that are less serious or severe, you still want to be a good person because someone's letting you into their home or telling you a personal story or being silly or being whatever. Like, you just want to make them feel safe and comfortable because once you have that footage, you can make them look like and, you know, you should take that. Huh?
Oh, you
should
went funky for a minute.
Yeah, you should take that, you know, with a lot of respect, I think.
It's a real responsibility. And also, you're right, you can do anything with the footage afterwards, but you wouldn't because you're a good person. And the people you're interviewing need to know that you wouldn't because you're a good person. And that authenticity has to be, even if you only have 5 minutes with that person before you sit them down in a chair, you need to show your authenticity. And that you're not a Hollywood, you know, asshole.
There's a sliding gray scale. I personally, everyone, this is pretty polarizing, but we kind of joked at the beginning that this Q&A we would just call Tiger King, so that we have hundreds of people do and talk about it. But when I was watching that, I was kind of questioning the filmmaking, and and I do that a lot when I watch things. What's their respect to the subjects? Are they being exploitational? Who can tell whose story? There's a lot of those things that we're all individuals at the end of the day, and we kind of make our own moral choices. But it is something that doesn't come off in the finished product. Like, you might question, like, did that person take advantage of it? Or Kitty's film, Casting Chamonix, a lot of people were like, did the actors know that there really was no movie? And Kitty was a really good person, but the film still left some ambiguity for how people interpreted that.
Thank you, guys. I know we've only got a couple minutes left, and I see that we have 2 more questions. The first one is technical. Sorry if you addressed it at all when I was off screen, but it is asking, one moment, is it possible to be competitive with a 1080 finished product versus 4K?
It depends where you're putting it. It just completely depends on your platform. If you're going to web only, sure. But most of the broadcasters, as Mitch was saying, want 4K now. It's becoming more and more of a common deliverable. And so competitive, depending on which platform you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, you've got 3 formats there. I don't think 8K is necessary right now. It's just my opinion. But I think making the jump to 4K from a workflow standpoint, there's still concerns on what you deliver. You might not be exporting 4K. I think, again, I don't get too much into the ones and zeros anymore, but a lot of deliverables are still 2K. But from a camera standpoint, if that's what you're referring to, I wouldn't be making any future investments in 1080p and would be doing it in 4K, unless it is a specific web-only, client video kind of thing. The 4K stuff has gotten more affordable than it was, 3 or 4 years ago, and 8K will probably be that, and 20K down the line would be my thoughts.
Thank you. I think I can hear Sue in the background.
Actually, that's my dog, I think.
That's yours. Great. And the last question I see is, when it comes to the writing component, do you favor keeping dialogue organic, or do you use interviews as a foundation with which you then make a script? So how do you kind of craft the narrative?
I'm wondering if the question is about, like, that sounds more if you're trying to write a feature or something out of the documentary. I'm not quite sure I follow the question, but whatever it is, I like organic. It's whatever is as natural as possible. If it's reenactments, I never use dialogue. I can't stand, if you can't afford real actors, don't do dialogue. It's a straight path to dramatic failure. If that's what that question is, I'm not sure I answered it.
That's a tricky question. I think it seems like a narrative film question a little bit, or as Carol was saying, like, reenactments, and that's being done a little bit more and more. Sorry to keep referring to Kitty's film, but there was reenactments in that, or Errol Morris's Wormwood was pretty incredible. I'll make a comparison to the project I did, Silent Rose, that just came out, that is hybrid. I did a lot of documentary interviews with the students in this school, and I cast actors to play the adults. I didn't write any dialogue. It was pretty improv based to be kind of organic and implied on real events and things like that. But I would never advocate for writing dialogue or interview subject for another person to say. And I think that kind of starts to discredit the documentary format, to be a purist and all of that. Sorry, Kelly, I think I sent that last question to everyone, which is a kind of a perfect ending question potentially.
Yeah, there you go. I'll just read it out loud then. I've been taught the story is never finished until picture lock. What are your thoughts on that? Should you still be open to new developments, even if it alters your cut or your story?
Absolutely. I mean, there comes a point when you just can't afford to cut anymore, and maybe you have to go get more money to tell this enhanced story. But I think in documentary, you have to be open at every minute until the thing is mixed and color corrected, and broadcast. It's just, you want to be flexible because it's also about truth. And if something else has happened, then you want to tell the truthful whole story and not shade it just because you're 6 weeks into editing. I mean, that's just not, I don't know. I don't think it has integrity to do it that way, personally.
I think you have to be done. No, I'm just kidding. Just because we're getting to it. I've heard, I agree, you should be open to it for sure. Crazy things happen. You do run the risk of false endings, and because it's nonfiction and life continues to go, you go, oh, I have to go shoot that. And I'm beefing with a filmmaker I'm working right now who's like, oh, I'm going to go shoot this, or I'm going to go shoot this. And like, man, we're not done with the film yet, and that's fine, but it can complicate it. And I think if you come back to some of those, if you come back to those storytelling elements, like what 3-act structure, 5-act structure, however you want to do it, or just your own like instinct, should it be in the film? Just because it's happening doesn't mean that it needs to be in the film. So I think you're going to have to use your discretion. And, someone like Carol can be like, you can probably decide, yes, that's worth capturing. No, that's not. So I think you will inevitably have to, draw a line in the sand of when the film is done, because hopefully these people are still around and their life continues. Just because they went to the grocery store. Coronavirus. How many films right now are going to alter their endings because of coronavirus, And is it really a part of the story, or is that just what we're all going through? I think you have to take into consideration some of those things.
I think that's a really good point about the virus and how everybody's going through this right now, and also a really good question to end on. So thank you. Thank you both
Thank you.
Thank you, all the attendees.
Yeah, this is awesome. For those of you who are there, hopefully the recording wasn't too interrupted when my internet petered out, but we'll put it up on YouTube, and we'll be in touch with any follow-up links that we want to send out. So thank you, attendees. Thank you, Carol and Mitch. You guys are awesome. This is great.
Awesome.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, audience. Nice kind of meeting you.
Yeah.
Bye, Mitch.
Bye, guys.